Hey there, and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. I'm Jack Wilson, 2025 MACO President, and proud to represent Queen Anne's County as their District 1 Commissioner. Here we break down Maryland's biggest policy debates, hear from the experts, and even throw a dad joke or two. So sit back, stay informed, and enjoy the conversation.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. Kevin Kinnally here with Michael Sanderson and Sarah Sample. This time of year, we tend to talk through what it's like putting together a county budget. You've got to have a proposal out there by April or May for hearings and public input. So you're building it right now, even while you don't know what the final outcomes from Annapolis might look like. So we're going to talk through this. The blueprint in school budgeting is a huge share of this. So Sarah has been digging in there, and Michael just put together a walkthrough on one county budget. We want to dig in a bit to that too. So Michael and Sarah, we have lots to get into today. Here in Annapolis, it is the BRFA hearing week, Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act. There's a lot on the table. So let's jump right in. Michael and Sarah, I hope you're both doing well. Hope you're both hanging in there.
Hanging in there is a good way to describe it, yes.
Let's start with the blueprint, Sarah. It's the biggest moving part in the entire budget scheme, definitely the biggest thing for counties, and it's huge for the state too, albeit maybe not right now.
Yeah, well, I guess since we're going to talk about the blueprint, let me just sort of ground it and remind our audience members sort of what it is. And so this is sort of, 10 years, I think is debatable at this point in terms of how long it was going to take to implement the blueprint. But essentially, it's the state's education reform plan that is meant to transform Maryland public schools into a world-class public education system. It's got very broadly 5 pillars that are all about attracting great teachers, focusing on early learning, college and career readiness, and leveling the playing field for achievement. And then there's also an accountability for spending and outcomes piece. But it requires a substantial amount of funding over a 10-year period. So that's in a nutshell what the blueprint is.
And I said not a necessarily a big deal for the state right now, because as a reminder, the state is paying for this with casino money that has been set aside for years because voters said so with the constitutional amendment. So this isn't necessarily a general fund issue today for them, right, Michael?
Right. It's just a different posture. The county government piece is already a mandate on the counties. You have to come up with your calculated share of all the blueprint costs. Even as we're phasing this stuff in, the state has the money in a reserve fund to be able to handle their share of these extra costs. So, I mean, you could make an argument that this is money that might have been otherwise free for the general fund if it weren't in this special fund. But as far as like accounting for today's budget, there is a reserve fund to handle this year's costs. So the back and forth that we're in the middle of doesn't affect this year's bottom line, which is tricky because this year's bottom line is a real big deal. So maybe the thing that makes sense to do is let's look back at, there was a bill hearing last week on the governor's proposal amidst several different things that the governor has introduced to try and get after fiscal issues and so forth. One of the things he's proposing is sort of a pause in certain elements of the blueprint, still get to the same end goals, but on a different timetable, and sort of making the case for why. So both of you have some, I think, reflections on that bill hearing. Kevin, you were in the pit and actually testified at the bill hearing, but both of us, have been talking with all these different stakeholders and watched all the discussions during the bill hearing. So I kind of want to distill that for our listeners a little bit. The starting point, I guess, Sarah, is the governor's pitch, which he unveiled, I think, for the first time at the MACO Winter Conference back in December, was, we're having trouble hiring enough teachers. So the ramp up quickly of collaborative time, hiring more teachers so each teacher gets to spend more time out of the classroom may not make sense right now. Maybe we should wait on that until we can recruit some more people. Is that sort of the essence of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the number that they were quoting, I think, was around 15,000 teachers are needed to actually pull this off, to get the teachers that amount of time out of the classroom. And so, yeah, I think that's sort of where that was coming from, and why the bill has a ton of sort of recruitment and retention stuff built into it to try to sort of get us towards a place where collaborative time rolling out at 60 and 40 is, I think, more viable. And that's sort of what we've heard from his team. But the other things in the bill, they had a component in there that was freezing community schools funding for I think it was 2 years, I want to say, and then it would basically be flat year over year. So there were lots of things in there that had to do with community schools, collaborative time, and then also recruitment and retention ultimately.
Right. So a number of things, and I think the overall framing was, we're still committed to getting to the goals that the blueprint calls for, but we think right now we're a few years in, and the reality on the ground is different than we were guessing back in 2018, 19, 20, when this whole thing was being assembled, and that's, I think, objectively true. So they're saying basically there are some pieces that we either shouldn't or can't do in 2026. Maybe let's dial them back a couple of years until we've got more ducks in a row, so to speak.
Yeah. And as we get further into this conversation, I mean, there are a lot of those things. I think that the reality when this was all devised is a little bit different than it is now. So I think it's important that these conversations are being had. It's just a matter of what we're going to see come out of it. But I want to
Right.
hear from Kevin's play-by-play of what it was like in the pit. That was kind of fascinating to watch.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
so I think both of you are on point. And as far as the hearing went, I mean, so you had quite the scene. This is in the new joint hearing room and at the Department of Legislative Services building. You had 4 committees there. So yeah, in the pit, looking up at all of them, it's kind of weird. But the vibe from that hearing for me was a lot of the proposals are in trouble, particularly community schools. I think they did a pretty good job of dismantling that from their perspective. And they talked a lot about uncertainty in Washington, uncertainty generally about schools and school funding, and that this maybe isn't the best time to pause community schools. They do provide a lot of benefits, particularly for people who live in underserved areas. And so to me, my read on that would be that that provision is in trouble. When it comes to the teachers and collaborative time, I think there were a lot of questions. There were a lot of concerns, but at the end of the day, it does save the state a lot of money. Now, of course, we know that the House and the Senate may be divided on this issue. We know the Speaker is very much, committed to not touching the blueprint, keeping things status quo. We also know that the blueprint is not causing budget problems right now for fiscal 26. So it's not like they have to do anything with it. But I think that most people can look at the out years and say, well, we probably should do something. We need to relieve some pressure on the budget. So it was an interesting hearing. It was all day. There were a lot of people there. It was certainly get your popcorn ready for some moments, but I think the vibe was this is not going to get out clean, and it may get out just limping across the line.
Yeah.
I thought so. I wasn't in the room and couldn't feel the vibe as well as you could firsthand, but watching it live, I thought maybe the most interesting moment of a pretty long hearing was I've forgotten who the stakeholder was, but at a public hearing, you hear from supporters and opponents and folks who want changes and so forth. So you take all this testimony from different stakeholders, and there were a number of stakeholders saying, I'm frustrated with what this does. I oppose it, or I wish you wouldn't have to do this, that sort of thing. No surprise. And somebody referred to this as like, your bill is going to mean these bad things. And the House Appropriations Chair sort of paused the speaker from it and says, I just want to make sure you understand, this is not our bill. This is the governor's bill. This isn't our bill. We're the legislators trying to decide whether to do this, but we didn't propose this. And that was almost a like take the air out of the room, like 3 seconds for me. Right?
You could hear a pin drop. You could definitely hear a pin drop, and that making sure that people understood that this wasn't the legislature's bill was definitely a theme, and I think that was reiterated a few times. So, I mean, a lot of this, it seemed like the partisan talking points that they got out to everyone in terms of the caucuses, but I do think that there is broad concern on both sides of the aisle for some of this stuff. And it's going to be difficult, I think, to do anything with the blueprint, of course. But I think that, like you and Michael said, Sarah, I think that there is a recognition from most folks that, these formulas were developed in a different time. The assumptions were developed in a different time. And so we know from a county government perspective that the blueprint is more expensive than it was before COVID. And I think that's reasonable and understandable. The state, maybe not so much, because, again, they're not feeling the pressure like counties are feeling it right now.
Yeah. But I think the important thing to add here, though, is that the conversation about adjusting certain elements of the blueprint doesn't have to be entirely about funding. I mean, there are definitely things that they could do that, would add a little bit more flexibility and make implementation a little bit smoother. I can definitely see from sort of like the original crafters of the blueprint perspective that a pause or a rollback of elements when it comes to funding, I can see that being a concern because of a commitment they made. So, I mean, and then from the hearing on the governor's bill, I mean, it was evident from the way, Michael just mentioned leadership from Appropriation and Ways and Means reacted to sort of that pausing of the different kinds of funding when it comes to collab time and community schools. But I mean, there are things that can be changed that don't necessarily hinge on some of that funding. And so I think we saw the superintendent's, what was it, a 30-point-12-page letter that was sort of highlighting some of this stuff. And I think it's things like, flexibility in some areas, definition changes, some clarifications on various elements. And we'll actually probably see some of that stuff being debated here shortly in a bipartisan bill that's being offered by I think it's Delegate Wims and Senator Karen Lewis Young.
Mm-hmm.
And it appears, I mean, from bills like that, it appears that they're trying to keep with most of the principles, but just trying to get a little bit more flexibility and smooth out some kinks. So I think some of those things that don't have a big budget impact could still be in the conversation, still be on the table, because I think it really serves the overall goal of serving students and getting them working for our economy and getting them good educations.
I think that's a great point.
Which is a shared perspective, what I mean?
Yeah, it's a great point. And I do want to point out too, I think we need to clarify that the governor's team is, they made clear at the bill hearing, they are committed to the blueprint, right? That they've made it clear that, hey, this is a pause. This is not, we're not abandoning the blueprint. So I want to be clear and fair that the governor's team made it very clear to the legislature that they are committed, but that they need to take a look and to make sure that this can actually work the way we want it to. So I think it's important to clarify that too.
Yeah. But again, like Michael said, there's no urgency there if it's not a state fiscal issue yet when it comes to those bigger price tags.
And it's hard to overstate how important that is in this debate, that we have seen tough fiscal years where members say, well, I really don't want to do this, but I recognize that this is an important linchpin to making the whole budget work. So, okay, I'll vote for the whole plan, even though I don't like this one big piece. Here, the effect on the state's bottom line for this year's budget is zero. It has a long-term effect, and eventually they'll be paying cash for education costs. But as long as right now there's a piggy bank, it's just a different debate. I like the way you set that up, Sarah, that the macro decisions about like taking a big pause on a major element of the whole plan might be off the table, but they may have some room to maneuver on micro things. Maybe some of the recruitment items that were in this bill meant to be, let's take money we save by pausing. Maybe they can find the way to keep those in or something like that. I don't know. But the specifics aside, they've got two levels of conversation about education policy and funding. There's a big picture and then some sort of underbrush. All of these have consequences, and I think we're going to connect some of the dots as we talk further on this episode, why some of those flexibility matters might be important for this year's budget for counties and schools.
Right. So,
and that takes us to county governments. They're trying to put their budgets together right now.
Exactly. And so, again, without knowing what the General Assembly is going to do, we have a lot of potential cost shifts on the table, straight on to county governments, onto local school systems. So it is a difficult time. And so I think that school systems have to submit their proposed budgets to county governments. That is starting now. Some of these are eye-popping numbers. And I mean, really, it's not just large counties with big budgets and the school systems are asking for a lot of money. This is across the board. We are seeing truly eye-popping numbers, particularly when you think about some of the total budgets for these counties who are being asked to contribute millions and millions more to schools. I mean, it's incredible to me, right?
Yeah, I mean, and the other layer to that is that for many of our counties, their local funding commitment to the schools is far exceeding the formula costs of the blueprint. And these requests that we are seeing that are for FY26 are increasing substantially, even from those already elevated numbers. And I think we were talking about this earlier. I think Carroll County is a good example. I mean, it's an average-sized county population-wise, so revenue growth and flexibility are limited there. And the school board, I think they were going to submit, I think it was a $57 million increase to the county commissioners. But I mean, this was the thing we were talking about earlier, that some people were marching outside because they were worried about cuts, even in that climate.
I mean, $57 million,
Yeah.
57 million. That's a huge number for a county of that size, for Carroll County. Schools are like, half the county budget, more or less. And the school system now is asking for a 23% increase. Michael, where could that
Oof.
possibly come from? I mean, it's eye-popping.
That took the wind out of me.
Yeah.
Right. I mean,
Yeah.
right. But the math just like it doesn't make any sense. I think the first place I'd start is there are times when we in the county community will kind of say we think this structure is broken, that school boards have an incentive to just ask for the moon and the stars, and if the counties cut it, then they're the villains, right? But I don't get that sense. I mean, I've talked to a lot of people in and around Carroll County, and my sense is the school board there are basically saying the state's telling us we need to do all these blueprint mandates. We got to launch new programs. We got to get a lot more resources into these particular schools, and to make those changes within the budget that we get. And they're kind of pointing to, hey, the state just has their formula, right? They wrote this formula back in 2018. They haven't adjusted it based on the real world costs. So the state says this is our share, we're done. And then we still need to do all the things no matter what they cost. So to afford that, you have to like shed lots of things that have been effective or successful right now because they're not mandated in the blueprint, unless you can get the county to come up with just like an avalanche of new money. So I think that's where the school board was. They're saying, we've got an outdoor learning program that seems to be really successful, and we've got a number of staff that we'd have to let go unless we get this big infusion. 57 million bucks is eye-popping, but I don't think it's them saying let's dress this up with a bunch of fantasy stuff. I think it's them
No.
saying to fund the blueprint and maintain positive things we've been doing here, we're going to have to feed both troughs at once, and that's going to take a lot more money than anybody thought.
Well, yeah, and that, like we discussed in our podcast a few weeks ago with Mary Pat Fannin from the superintendents, I mean, that's an element that no one is really talking about as much in terms of sort of the flaw in the plan. And I think you sort of already touched on this. It's paid for with money that does not go as far as it was supposed to. I mean, the forecasts were sort of written in stone years ago and do nothing to address the costs and the challenges of today, but with all the remaining mandates.
Right. So it's wild to look across the board and think about again kind of what we're looking at, what counties are facing right now. So while the state tells each county what its mandated funding amounts are, the real world pressures of the blueprint plan, which really tells the school systems what to do, means that there's intense pressure on counties to come up with a lot more money on top of that. And again, as we sit here in Annapolis, we're looking at hundreds of $millions in cost shifts just in the fiscal 2026 budget. MACo is going to have a lot to say about that, but it does, Sarah, put counties in a tough spot, especially when they're being asked to provide millions and millions on top of what they're already providing and over and above what they're supposed to provide under the blueprint.
Yeah, and Michael just sort of touched on that too, that, even though they're increasing the funding, there are these successful programs that students and parents love that the school, systems want to keep doing, but they just are in a situation where it's going to be things Michael mentioned, like outdoor ed programs, or like, it could be band or sports. I mean, it's just, there's not enough money to carry blueprint and what I call sort of blueprint plus, which is everything you want to do, but then there's also everything you've got to do. So, yeah.
All right, so let's take a quick break there. And when we come back, we're going to talk about budget cuts and watching the chaos in Washington, all that and more after the break.
I'm Dr. Jen Ashton, your host for Season 2 of The Visibility Gap, a podcast presented by Cigna Healthcare. Throughout this season, we'll be tackling something vital, the women's health gap. We'll hear from real people and experts as we unpack important topics like maternal health, menopause, and heart disease. Listen in and download the new season wherever you get your podcasts.
Okay, welcome back to the Conduit Street podcast. Kevin Kinnally here with Michael Sanderson and Sarah Sample. Education funding is a big piece of the puzzle, but in a true crisis, we know that there's a plan to get the state budget into balance and big pieces that are part of the county budget for this year too. So let's get into that. Let's talk about what's going on, what's on the table, and then we'll get into all the things coming out of DC and the worry there. So Sarah, let's talk about education funding just being a giant piece of this puzzle and what counties are facing now in terms of what's happening in Annapolis and then what's happening back home with school budgets and requests.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would actually throw it to Michael because he did an article this week that went through all of sort of like Dorchester's impacts, and just for a single county, sort of brick by brick, and putting it in terms of sort of one small and sort of fairly poor county. And I think it makes it feel more real when you think about it that way, rather than like, having a bunch of charts and you've got 24 jurisdictions and then you've got that total big number at the bottom. Like, I think I want to hear Michael sort of describe that sort of brick by brick component that affects Dorchester or any county.
Yeah, that was exactly my thinking of trying to turn this into reality, because different stories in different jurisdictions. And so when you try and say, well, this is going to affect the counties by $90 million, that feels abstract. I mean, it's a big number. That's a needle moving number, but it doesn't really tell much of a story. So I like the idea. And Dorchester, Dorchester has it specifically really tough. So, and I don't see how they dig out of this hole. So I like the idea of, let's digest this at the single county level and say, okay, you're the budgeteer in Dorchester. Like, how do you come up with a first draft budget there? And after you go through step by step, I'm like, wow, you're painted into a corner, aren't you?
Right. So we've done an episode talking about all the proposed cost shifts. I don't want to, have a heart attack while I'm sitting here today and get my blood really boiling. But we're going to talk about it.
It doesn't take much for you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big part of the picture. A lot of this is absurd. So, Michael, let's get into that and some of the shifts on the table. I feel like we get a new one every day. And, it's overwhelming in many ways, especially when you combine it with what's happening in Washington.
I think, right. Like, sometimes they use that phrase perfect storm when two or three things are happening at the same time. I don't know. I've lost count of how many waves are convening on the same spot in Annapolis where decision makers are trying to sort through this. But just the cost shifts themselves, like $21 billion of the state assessment office that we don't run. They're state employees. We don't manage it, but we're going to send the bill to counties for that. They got a shortfall in the pension system. And so the current proposal is, let's take about 93 million of that and just ship it to the counties in an invoice, take it off our budget, send it to the counties. Interesting little twist to say, oh, community colleges too, by the way. We didn't make any of those decisions. We're not part of that shortfall, but yeah, them too. In every one of those cases, the plan isn't, we're going to cut the spending or we're going to raise the revenue to live up to our commitments. It's just, we'll just send a bill to somebody else and have the problem become their problem, not our problem. Just make the counties pay for it.
Yeah, wait, how did you describe that? You called it like I think you called it like a parlor trick, like the General Assembly trying to like pull off a parlor trick. Like, explain that to the audience. Like, what are you talking about?
No, I just think, I mean, okay, so part of this is just being on social media and you speak more casually and so forth. But to me, that's sort of the point. Like the real, I could make the budget disappear, voila. And it's like, no, you didn't cut the budget. You didn't find the revenue to pay for the budget. You just said, now Charles County is going to pay for a bunch of this money. It's like that didn't solve the budget problem. It just sent it somewhere else. It's like, the assistant slides through and now suddenly she disappears. I think it's like the magician pulling the wool over everybody's eyes. They didn't solve anything. They just sent the problem to somebody else.
And I think it's funny in some ways. I mean, we hear leaders in Annapolis talking about, oh my gosh, the federal government's going to shift these costs onto Maryland, and that's not right. And they turn around and say, well, we'll just shift the costs onto the counties. I mean, it's right. We're not solving anything. We are not fixing the problems. We're just, shoving the problem to someone else. And I mean, Michael, you only touched on a few things that are on the table, but there are a lot of other things. I mean, we're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars in cost shifts. And by the way, I mean, and again, I don't want to get too fired up, but there's no doubt about it. If they just pass this BRFA clean and shift hundreds of millions onto county governments, this is, make no mistake, this is a state mandated property tax increase, especially because 2/3 of Marylanders live in counties that impose the maximum local income tax rate. And so these cost shifts would leave counties with no flexibility to absorb this burden. And the only option would be to raise property taxes that would hit renters who see costs passed down from homeowners already struggling with rising assessments. So forcing counties into this position is reckless, in my opinion, and it will it's a mandated property tax increase. We hear a lot about affordable housing. Raising property tax rates isn't going to help that. So we're kind of being pushed into a corner with no way out. And every day, it's the costs are just piling up, and it is overwhelming in many ways. It's a lot to think about, and again, especially with DC. And Michael, last week we heard another shoe drop. An analyst from the Department of Legislative Services said, "Hey, we see that you're shifting some of the pension costs. Why don't you go ahead and just double the biggest of these cost shifts, which is teacher pensions, and just bill the counties for every penny of this pension system shortfall," right? So that's just, I mean, just on top of everything else, that's just like another $93 million just shipped to the counties, no explanation, no justification.
Right. So let me try and do a miniature version of what I did in the blog item on Dorchester County. Let me set up some of these dominoes for what it looks like for one jurisdiction. They're in the middle of the Eastern Shore. You drive over the Choptank River, and there you are in Cambridge. That's the county seat of Dorchester. This is, a relatively small jurisdiction, about 30,000 people, lower income than most of the state, that sort of thing. So let me tee this up a little bit and kind of connect the dots between what's going on with their budget, all these cuts and shifts, and where it leaves them. So big picture, like walk with me. Dorchester County's budget has about like a nice term we like to use in budgeting is own source revenues, not what you get in grants and aid and support, but just what comes from your own taxes and fees levied locally. For them, it's like $66 million in the current year's budget. And you look at taxes and fees, those are the things. 57 out of the 66 comes from the big two, property taxes and income taxes. That's the structure the state has set up for the counties. We use those as 1, 2. They're number 1 and number 2 in every single county, and they always make up the lion's share of local revenues. So no surprise. So 90% or so of your revenues come from those two things, and that's really the main place to go. Just like you said, right, Kevin?
Right. That's exactly right, Michael. It's exactly the only place to go. And so, again, this is just for a county like Dorchester, and I think your piece really hit home. And just walking through the mechanics of what this means, there's nowhere else to go. They're a poor county, a disparity grant county. By the way, there are disparity grant cuts. We're cutting grants for teacher pensions that really help poor counties. So that's gone, and then you're getting more teacher pension costs for a poor small jurisdiction without a tax base. The only place to go is property taxes. And by the way, massive property tax increases for what Dorchester is facing. If this comes to fruition, it's unsustainable, right? It's unsustainable, and there's nowhere to go. So I think that you did a great job highlighting it, Michael, and I think you did a great job walking through and telling the story. And I think you'll hear a lot of counties this session come forward and tell their stories and what exactly this would mean in their jurisdictions and for their residents, which are shared constituents at the state and local level.
Okay, so I want to go through Dorchester step by step. So let me try and run the tape for you, if that makes sense. Okay,
Yep.
So $66 million is what they bring in revenue. The overwhelming share comes from income and property taxes. First of all, we start with the schools, right? That's the biggest mouth to feed in every county budget. It's public schools. The school system is saying, just like that story from Carroll County, to fund the blueprint and maintain the things that they feel like they need to do, they need a $10.5 million bump. Now, I don't know what's in that request. I don't know the details. We can't know the details on the ground, but I suspect that is another sincerely thought through, we need to do the blueprint. It costs more than what the state's giving us, so we need your help. But the state says you absolutely have to do your share of the blueprint, period. And for Dorchester, that's a bump of 2.6 million. That's an 11% increase. So
11%.
not quite as staggering. Yeah, not quite as staggering as the request in from Carroll County, but still, if your revenues aren't particularly strong, then I don't know how you get there. Anyway, let's play it out. So you got sluggish revenues. You've got the state mandating your biggest line item needs to go up by 11%. Now here come the Dorchester effects of all those budget cuts. So I mentioned, the cost of the assessment office, for them, it's almost $200,000. for this teacher pension idea. Oh, like $550,000. Oh, we're going to invoice you for costs at the pension for your community college. That's another 40,000. By the way, we're going to shuffle the deck over who pays what for students who need lots of special care in your school. That's another $50,000. And then this latest idea of let's just go ahead and double the big teacher pension shift. That's another 550. So like you run the tape on all this sort of stuff and you say, okay, all those cuts and shifts on top of an already wobbly budget, this is looking really bleak, right?
Right. And we're still not done, right? Because the BRFA also includes income tax changes. And for most counties, that means that they're just going to lose some of that income tax revenue because of the changes in income tax from the governor's BRFA.
Right. So the perfect storm finds yet one more wave to land in the same spot. So for Dorchester, if these income tax changes happen, they lose $1 million in local income tax. And if you want, you can also mention, you already made mention of this, Kevin, that they're a disparity grant jurisdiction, that they get so little out of their local income tax because they don't have a lot of high income residents. They're way below the state average, and the state tries to make that up, saying you did your best with the tax rate. We'll try and get you closer to the median. But their disparity grant this year drops by 300,000 from last year. So compared to last year's base, like the year we're in with 66 million bucks in taxes, they're right now scheduled to lose $1 million because of state law changes and another 300,000 because of that disparity grant on time.
Right. So we did a podcast last year about fluky formulas. Here we go again, right? Especially when it comes to the disparity grant.
Exactly right. So I think of this like, like the accountant running a tape. You'd add in all these numbers, you add all this stuff up, and you basically are looking at this relatively small county has got a $5 million problem pending with the state's budget plan. All these different pieces together total in the neighborhood of 5 million or a little bit more than that. And they still have to come up with an 11% increase for their schools. And even if they do that minimum, the schools will justifiably be saying, well, we're still making cuts if that's all you can give us is the minimum, because we really need 10, not 2.5. So, because they're mandated to do all the blueprint things, and those are more expensive than what the state's funding. So the math here is just inconsequential.
So you guys are giving me anxiety. So what is the way out of this? Like, what is the solution here?
I mean, honestly, I really don't have any idea what you do. I mean, you can do some back of the napkin math and come up with, okay, so raise your property tax, right? They're one of the counties in the state who's already gone to the maximum on the income tax. So they can't just raise their income tax rate. They got nowhere to go there, no chance. So it's just property taxes. What if you do a massive property tax increase? Like, I can't remember the last time a county, I mean, I've been at Mako for 30 years. I don't think I've ever seen a county raise the property tax by 10 cents. But what if they did 10 cents? That gets them like three and a half million bucks. Like $3.5 million maybe on a 10-cent property tax increase. That doesn't even pay for these cuts and shifts, much less pay for the bump that they have to give to education.
Right. And
or anything else that's important locally.
Right. You're already at 3.2% in Dorchester, a poor county. So when you run the tape, like you said, Michael, there you have it. It is a nightmare. You want to wake up from it, but you can't, right? The state has something like, over $250 million on the table right now as cuts and shifts to counties. And now the defining element of this through, this tough budget season, it's incredible. And they're going to tie both arms behind your back or just one, right? Because again, if you think about the story in Dorchester, there's nowhere else to go. You said 10 cents on the property tax wouldn't even get them there. I've never seen anyone raise the property tax by 10 cents either. That would, I'm sure people would revolt, but that's unsustainable, obviously. And obviously that would create challenges with affordable housing thing, one of the policy areas that Mako is trying to address in partnership with the state. But again, when you're tying both of our hands behind our back, there's nothing we can do. I also think it's important to remember that counties are partners in the blueprint. If counties can't do it, the whole thing falls apart. So we have been trying to work with the state and figure out ways to do this, but it's important to remember that they can't tie our hands behind our backs and limit our revenue and shift more costs and still expect us to come up with the money for the blueprint and all the other things that we need to do locally, right? So it really is a nightmare. And we know the BRFA hearings are this week. It looks like the state fiscal decisions are going to be pushed back a bit. So we have a couple weeks to figure out what's happening there. But Sarah, let's get into, why the state is deciding to pause some of these decisions and what that could mean moving forward.
Yeah. I mean, this is kind of, I mean, maybe not obvious, but so I think they're just watching for another fiscal shoe to drop. I mean, I think they're watching to see what Congress does and what happens with the federal budget. I mean, even on top of that, if there's a federal shutdown, the Maryland economy is going to take a serious hit from that too, right?
I mean, there's definitely some effects. Whatever the Congress does, and potentially some of the sort of cost-cutting efforts that are underway at the federal level could affect us, could affect the Maryland economy because we have an awful lot of federal workers and connected things in our economy. But there's also a lot on the table for the state government directly and counties. I mean, Kevin, you wrote on the Conduit Street blog, I don't know, it's been a week or 10 days now, but you wrote talking about the federal effects that could land right in the state's lap and to some degree in the counties too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll link to that piece. But obviously, the biggest piece is Medicaid. And as we're here recording on Wednesday, there was just a narrow vote to send a big fiscal package out of the House of Representatives last night. We don't have all the details yet, but if the feds decide to scale back the support for Medicaid, it's currently a 50-50 split for the most part. That could be their own cost shift right onto the state that would unfairly lessen their problem, but create a new one for states like Maryland and others. So that obviously would be a huge deal. They count in the trillions over in DC, not in the billions. So that's probably the biggest thing on the table right now. And I know that state leaders are worried about that, but there are all kinds of other issues and problems when it comes to what could happen from DC and how it could impact Maryland. One of the biggest ones too that's kind of lingering out there, funding for the Key Bridge, for replacing the Key Bridge. A lot of people think, oh, well, they already said they're going to pay for that, so we're fine. Well, unless it's in a continuing resolution, right, unless Congress keeps that funding there, it's not paid for. And we've seen some of the tactics from the new administration in trying to withhold funding from states unless they do things, right? That could be problematic for a state like Maryland, too. So, yeah, there's a lot there, Michael. We'll make sure to link it. But Medicaid is certainly on the minds of a lot of people right now in Annapolis.
Right. And I can't help but always carry around a cocktail napkin to try and do a little bit of mathematics on. And there aren't any details in the congressional plan. That's kind of by design. They were afraid if they had too many details, they'd lose votes on the floor of the House. And this thing passed by a whisker without the details, but it has these like embedded targets. And one of the big numbers is for healthcare services, which is almost certainly going to be Medicaid. Their target is $880 billion over 10 years. They tend to do 10-year scores. Annapolis does 1-year scores. But 880 over 10 years, we tend to think of, well, Maryland is about 2% of the federal population. So the easiest thumbnail is just say, well, 2% of anything the feds do is the Maryland effect. 880 over 10 years, like that shakes out to something like $1.7 billion a year to Maryland. Like if that literally just lands in the state budget as a big hole to be filled, that's absolutely bananas. And I'm completely with you on your earlier comment that there's a direct parallel between how irresponsible that would be for Congress to not solve their problem, but just send it downhill. And then this raft of proposals pending in Annapolis to do the same thing and send them to counties.
Right. And by the way, of course, we know that the federal government shuts down after March 14th unless there's a deal. We'll be watching, and NACO and everyone on the happenings there, the National Association of Counties, certainly they are paying very close attention, but so will state fiscal leaders. It's a big item for them too. And just to, sort of put a cap on that for Maryland, shutting down the federal government, we are uniquely vulnerable. We have a lot of federal employees, 160,000, and tens of thousands of contractors. So we are disproportionately impacted by federal funding lapses. The 2018-2019 partial shutdown demonstrated these risks. Maryland workers missed $778 million in wages, and the state lost millions in tax revenue. And for contractors, often without retroactive pay, could face even steeper losses, and that would echo past economic strain. So businesses tied to federal operations would also suffer. It would cut state and county tax bases and threaten local economies, particularly in areas with high federal employment. So that's, we're talking about potential Medicaid shifts, But let's not forget that the government could shut down on March 14th unless they come up with some sort of a continuing resolution to keep the government running. But things are chaotic in DC right now, so who knows? So that is also lingering as something that could be very, very bad for the state and just add to the problems that are already upon the table.
Beware the Ides of March. That's from Julius Caesar. I think maybe with this episode we run it with the title of something like A Lean and Hungry Look.
Ooh,
Maybe
like
too
that.
much. Maybe too
The
much.
Ides of
What's
March.
that a reference to? Like, oh, is that Shakespeare?
It is.
Jesus Christ.
I think Sarah's had
Sorry,
enough.
I'm more of like a Bob Fosse person theatrically.
We've
Shakespeare.
adequately given Sarah plenty of anxiety, and now she doesn't like the episode. She doesn't like the title. I don't know. Sarah, do you
Get
have
me
any
out of here.
do you have any closing thoughts, Sarah? Again, I know you're in the weeds, and
That jazz.
right.
Exactly. There you go. That's my
we're-
closing thought.
Yeah, we're in the weeds, Sarah. You're tracking lots of bills. You're embedded in this education stuff. I mean, any closing thoughts, anything for people to take away in terms of what counties face right now, where they are, and any necessary flexibility that our local school systems need to make this work?
Yeah. I think with Blueprint, I think anything that sort of does anything to roll back funding is pretty much a non-starter. But like I said before, there are some things that the superintendents did a very good job, I think, of laying out in terms of concerns that they're having. And maybe, some people can debate whether or not that is a founded concern or not. But at the end of the day, there are 30 points in that letter, and there are definitely some that I think they would be wise to consider when the experts on the ground that are implementing this are telling you that this is stuff that they need, especially when I think Mary Pat had told us that there was 100% turnover in the superintendent since Blueprint rollout started. So I think it'll be important to watch that bill from Delegate Wims and Karen Lewis Young. We'll put the bill number in the show notes. But I think the conversation is going to continue around that for sure. But otherwise, there's some smaller stuff that they're looking at that we're not as focused on. I think there's a lot of things that have to do with cell phone policies and what's going to happen with that.
As a reminder,
and some stuff to do with juvenile offenders and in-school attendance, things like that.
Right. And as a reminder for all of our listeners, counties don't do curriculum. We are the bank for schools. So the things about cell phone policies and discipline doesn't necessarily touch the county governments. That's a school system issue, but we are the bank, and that's a big deal. So, Michael, unless you have any more Shakespeare you want to put out there, I think we can go ahead and leave it there for today. Any closing thoughts from you, Michael?
Just shut me down. We're going to get through this.
I like it. All right. So we'll leave it there for today. We talked a lot today about a lot of things. We're going to put links in the show notes so that you can keep up. Things are fluid in Annapolis. Like we said, the big BRFA hearings, the Budget and Reconciliation and Financing Act hearings are this week. So that should give us a little bit more indication of where the General Assembly is with some of this stuff, but we'll keep you informed. As always, you should be paying attention to the Conduit Street blog. Constant updates there throughout session. Every bill Mako testifies on gets a blog article, so pay attention to that. You can also follow along on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and then, of course, like I said, the Conduit Street blog. But for Sarah Sample and Michael Sanderson, this is Kevin Kinnally signing off, and we will talk to you soon.